but the best person you can have access to is really their chief of staff. So you pick up your phone and you call the chief of staff, hoping that, fingers crossed, whatever he tells you will be what the president would have told you if you were speaking to the president, right? If we understand this analogy, then we understand everything about study design and why we pay attention to certain things. So let's bring the analogy back home. The president here is what we'll call the population. So when we do studies, especially cross-sectional studies, we have two separate things. We have the population, and then we have the sample. The population is the total universe of everything we want to get our hands on. But of course, nobody can access the true population. Why? Because we can't sample everybody in the world or everybody in the target population. So what do? We get access to the sample. Now, what the president will have said is called the parameter, right? So if we had managed to get our hands on the president, whatever he told us is what we'll call the parameter. But what we get from this guy, the Mr. Secretary, is what we call an estimate, right? It's called an estimate because it's estimating the parameter. It's standing in place of the parameter, but it's not a parameter. So it's our, well, best available version of the truth. The truth is what the president will have told us, but since we can't access the president, we have to use the secretary to get an estimate. So again, the population is the president. What the president would have said is a parameter. The secretary represents our sample, and what the estimate says is called the estimate. You know, what the sample says is called estimate. Now, as you can imagine, sometimes there will be discrepancies between what the sample says versus what the president says. In this case, the president says it's 28%. The secretary tells us it's less than half. Well, that's a bit ambiguous, right? So whenever we have a difference between what the parameter would have said versus what the sample has said, that's what we call bias. So bias is a difference between the actual or true value versus what we have estimated from our sample, right? So that sets the stage for everything we do. Of course, the phone line where you're communicating with Mr. Sample that has to do with questionnaire design. So somehow when we're designing studies, we have to make sure that we pay very close attention to how we estimate all of these things, right? There are two very important components we'll be talking about repeatedly during the rest of this talk, right? And that is issues of validity and issues of precision. So when you have a number like this number says 10.1%, 95% confidence interval, 6.5% to 15.2%, right? The reason why we have these two different numbers is because they are telling us very different things. This 10.1% has to do with validity, right? So essentially we're saying, this is what this guy says. The secretary says, oh, it's less than half. That's exactly what this number is. And then we ask him, are you sure? Are you really sure that's what the parameter would have said? And it's like, well, I'm not very sure, right? This I am not very sure is what we capture as 95% confidence intervals. We're trying to see how certain are we of our estimate. All right, so how do we interpret this 95% confidence intervals? We want a volunteer from the audience to tell us how do we, technically, what's the correct interpretation of the confidence intervals? Anybody wants to try?
Please raise your hands. Volunteers, okay. Wait, I see hands, but wait. Okay, sorry. Checking. Sham. Let me let you. Please unmute yourself. Shamsuddin.
And before you answer, I want a mock version of the answer that is just playful, that answers it based on this analogy. So answer it in terms of what the secretary is saying and what the president would have said. And then we want a second person who will then answer it in a more technical way. So who wants to go first?
All right. I'm already muted. I think I can go first.
Okay, great.
All right. So thank you, Prof, for this session again. So I think based on what the president would have said, and also aligning that with what the secretary have said, the confidence interval, what he's trying to predict is, or trying to determine is that the actual, what the president will have said lies between 6.5% to 15.2%. 95% of the time, or in other words, if the president would have spoken, the value we could have gotten from the president would be lying between the 6.5% to 15%. And this value comes with 95.
Okay, I'm not sure if it's my network or his, but there seems to be a breakage there.
Okay, would you like me to repeat
Okay, no,
myself?
okay, no, I heard some part of it. Okay, so let me rephrase the question to you, right? If we ask the secretary questions over and over and over and over, regardless of whatever the topic is, we are saying that 95% of the time, complete the sentence. So if we were to grab the secretary and ask him questions over and over and over on any given topic, we are saying that 95% of the times, what will happen?
Okay. Muhammad, do you want to try?
5% of the time, it will be between 6.5 to 50.2%.
No, for the secretary, right? Just forget about this thing here, the one at the bottom. We're just saying, he's speaking in broad generalities. For the secretary analogy, we're saying that if we were to grab the secretary and ask him questions over and over and over, 95% of the times, what do we expect would be the case?
The case will be between those two numbers, percentages.
Okay. Somebody else wants to try?
Ntumishi?
Yeah, so if if we were to ask the secretary over and over, basically means that in most cases, her precision would be between the two numbers.
Okay. Maybe I'm asking a question in a read my mind kind of way. But what we're asking is this, let me be more specific. 95% of the time, the answer that the secretary gives us what would be the nature of that answer?
Appeal? Um,
The way I understand it is that when you say 95% of confident intervals, and you are asking the secretary over and over, it means the secretary, the response of the secretary in that regard is 95% precise, with 6.5 to 15.2% error.
Okay. If we're talking about the secretary, just ignore all of these numbers below. We're just saying, we're not talking about numbers with the secretary. We're saying, okay, if we were to grab the secretary and ask him questions over and over and over, 95% of the times, what he told us will have what the president will have told us. That's all we're saying.
Okay.
So it's not complicated at all. We're saying that, Mr. Secretary, we're to grab him and ask him questions over and over. 95% of the times, the answer he gives us will be exactly what the president will have told us. And then the other 5% of the times, well, he just tells us his own thing. He just makes up his own thing. So that is the idea, right? That's what we're trying to understand in a very, very simple context. But for us to really understand the concept of 95% intervals, we need to understand the world of parameters and population and how that overlaps with what we do in research, which is take samples and from those samples get estimates. So all we're trying to do is say, how confident are we in this estimate we've gotten, right? So in this case, we have a point estimate here, which is a measure of validity. So in other words, how close is this to what the president will have said. And then here is reliability. If I do this over and over, what amount of times do we expect that what we've gotten will be the case? So here we're saying that if we spent the rest of our lives taking samples, or if we took a very large number of samples over and over, 95% of the time, the true population parameter will fall between 6.5% to 15.2, right? So that is how to understand confidence intervals. All right. So that sets the stage. I spent quite some amount of time to explain that concept, because if we don't understand this concept, then it's very hard for us to understand why we do a lot of things in research. Why do we calculate sample size? Why do we sample and all of those things? It's inherently very intimately tied to this concept we've explained here. All right, let's move on. So we introduced the concept of PICO or PICOTS last week. And we said this represents population intervention comparison, outcome, time, and study design. Obviously, it becomes very immediately clear that this applies only to interventional studies because we have I for intervention. Interventional studies, as the name implies, is when we, the investigators, are stepping in to intervene, right? So imagine you see two people fighting and you step in and say, hey, stop fighting, and you separate them. Well, you're intervening in something that is not your business, right? That is what interventional studies are. We are stepping in to intervene. We say, okay, you, this group, take this treatment, and you, this group, take this other treatment, right? So the investigator jumps in to intervene, and so we call it an interventional study. The opposite of interventional study, obviously, would be an observational study. So I see two people fighting. I do not step in to intervene. All I do is just stand by the side and take notes, like, wow, he gave him an uppercut. That was interesting, right? I'm not intervening. I'm just describing what I am observing, right? So observational studies are different because the investigator is not stepping in to intervene. That is why we call it observational, because you are just observing. So clearly, this PICOT framework will not necessarily apply to when we design studies, observational studies, and specifically, descriptive studies. So we're going to talk about a different version of the PICO framework specifically for descriptive studies, and we'll see how that applies in our study design. So the P in this PICO for descriptive study is still population. So for that, there are two questions we want to consider. The question of how many and how. How many has to do with the sample size. So how many people do we need to include in our survey? The question of how is how do we sample them? So it's always a twin question. How many people do I need? So let's say you decide that you need 2,000 people. Well, how then are you going to select those 2,000 people? That is an issue of sampling. And we also have to worry about inclusion and exclusion criteria, because remember, we want the secretary to reflect very, very closely with what the president is, right? When presidents are selecting their chief of staff, they take great care to find people who reflect their values and who can speak for them. So the same way, when we're drawing samples, we want to make sure that the sample is representative of the true population, right? And that is where issues of sampling or probability sampling comes in. If there's no probability sampling, then there's no basis for inferences. I will talk about that a bit more. For the I in descriptive studies, instead of intervention, now we have independent strata. Remember, we had intervention for interventional studies, but the I now stands for independent strata. Strata are groups. We're going to talk about that and explain that more. And we'll talk about, should we stratify or should we not stratify? And then C, clusters. We also have to worry about clusters, especially when we're doing large surveys. So the question then is, what is the difference between clusters and strata? What do we choose as units of clusters? And how many clusters should we have? O is outcome. And we have to worry about how do we define the outcome conceptually and how do we measure it operationally. T is time. And so in this case, we're talking about, are we going to conduct a cross-sectional survey, which is just one time, or do we design a longitudinal study where we follow people over time? And then study design. The hallmark of a great or innovative researcher is trying to get as much, making sure that the juice is worth the squeeze. So the general perception about surveys is that they are ordinary surveys. But then how can you take something ordinary and make something extraordinary out of it? If you're designing a survey, how can you nest other study designs within the survey? So for example, how can you nest experiments within the survey so that when you publish it, it's no longer seen as an ordinary survey because you've really done something extraordinary with it. So the goal here is to say, don't think of when you're launching a study or just a survey, don't think of it only as a survey. Think of how can I innovatively incorporate other designs or nest other study designs within the survey so that the kind of research I do, the kind of publications I generate, the kind of journals where I publish them in is just more sophisticated than if I had done an ordinary survey. We'll talk more about that in a second. All right, so we're going to pick each of the elements of PICO and see how do we consider them in our study design. So for the P, which is the population, we talked about the two questions we need to ponder, which is how and how many. So now, I'm sure you've seen this bullseye image in, if you've taken any EP 101 class, you surely have seen it. So we need to understand two more new concepts. And the two new concepts we want to introduce are the words bias and error. So this is error, this is bias. Think of error as an innocent mistake. So you're sitting down and somebody steps on your foot and it's like, ouch. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry. That was my bad. That was a mistake. And you're like, okay, sure, mistakes happen. But then that's a different story when the next 5 minutes, this guy comes and steps on your foot again. You're like, okay, dude, it's clear you have an agenda here, right? This is no longer an honest mistake. It's happening way too often and in the same systematic manner that we can conclude that this is not a mistake. This is not, at least it's not an honest mistake, right? So that's how you want to think of bias and error. Error is like an unintentional and honest mistake. Bias is a mistake with an agenda. It's intentional. There's a systematic pattern to it, right? And let's tie that back into our previous illustration. Why do we concern ourselves with issues of bias and with the issues of error? Well, we need to tackle both of them. It's not as if we just want to tackle one and leave the other. We need to tackle bias because bias affects the point estimate. And we need to tackle error because error affects the precision, right? So error affects precision, bias affects validity. So if there is a systematic way in which we capture data, or there's some, there's biases in how we, design studies. And there are three types of bias, by the way. We have confounding bias, measurement bias, and selection bias. If any of those are present, this point estimate we get will be biased. So remember we said bias is when what the secretary tells you and what the president tells you doesn't match 100%. If there's a gap between the true population parameter and what we have gotten, then the difference, if it's not equal to 0, means we have bias. And so we address issues of bias by ensuring that threats to internal validity are addressed. And then the reason we're interested in error is because, like I said, error increases imprecision of our measurements, right? And so that's why we're interested in both addressing issues of error and issues of bias. And this is how we address them. So here you have two scales. One scale is talking about a scale for precision. The other is a scale for validity, right? So you can see here it says as the sample size increases, we become more precise in our estimates. So, and then as the method we're using to sample people becomes more representative, our estimates become more valid. So again, remember we said there are two questions we always have to ask: how and how many. How many has to do with sample size. How is how are we sampling these people? When we sample in a way that is representative, that means our estimates are valid because in this way, the sample becomes more representative of the population, right? So sample size has nothing to do with validity. That's a take-home message. So please, we want to avoid this error we see in publications where authors will say, oh, our sample size was very large. We had 20,000 people, so our results are valid. It's like, no, validity has nothing to do with sample size. Validity has to do with everything to do with precision. The more you have people in the study, the more precise it will be. And the reason why is because of what we said earlier. The more people you have, it means that there's less measurement error in the sample. And if there's less error, that means that your estimates are more precise. We measure precision by the width of the confidence interval. So when your confidence intervals are very wide, we say that your estimates are, they are imprecise. If they are very narrow, we say they're precise. So here, we are looking at a scenario where, God himself whispered to us that the true population parameter for, let's say for smoking, was 20%. So we know this because a divine force told us that it is certainly 20%. So here we got our first estimate. We took a first sample, and from that sample, we got a point estimate of 40%, and the 95% confidence intervals are 39.8 to 40.2. So if you look at the confidence intervals, they're very narrow. They're very tight, which means that they're very precise. But 40 is not the same as 20, all right? And so here you have a case where you have high precision, but it's precise but not valid. In this case here, the sample yielded a point estimate of 40%, and the confidence intervals range from 20.4 to 59.6. So here we have very wide confidence intervals, and of course, 40 is not 20. So here we have a case where there is no validity and no precision. In this case here, the point estimate is 20%, but the confidence intervals range from 0.4% to 39.6. Obviously, they're very wide, but somehow the estimate itself is the same thing as the population parameter. In this case, we have validity, but we don't have precision. And here we have all, both precision and validity, because we have point estimate of 20.0%, same as the true population parameter, and the confidence intervals range from 19.8 to 20.2. So we have results that are both valid and precise. Now, since we're talking about the population, it's also very important for us to, you can, I see some hands up, you can type your questions in the chat, and I will try and weave them into the discussion, but then you will have opportunity to ask questions at the end as well. So, since we're talking about the population, it's also very important for us to understand the concepts of inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now, what you see most authors write is they will say, our inclusion criteria were males and people living with HIV. Then they'll say our exclusion criteria were females and people not living with HIV. That is not what exclusion criteria are, because the way they frame it makes it as if the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria are opposites of each other. So meaning that if my inclusion criteria was just being male, that means my exclusion criteria is being female. That is not what inclusion and exclusion criteria refer to. Think of it as this way, right? Inclusion criteria is like putting your arms around this population and saying, everybody that falls within my embrace is part of the study. So this is the arms I put around this group. Everybody who falls within my embrace is particularly screened in by inclusion criteria. So all these guys are screened out by the inclusion criteria because they are not within my embrace. Now, within these guys who are within my embrace, I now look and say, hey, you are within my embrace, but unfortunately, you don't meet this criterion, whatever it is. So I will have to remove you from the inner circle and throw you out. That is exclusion, right? So this person here met the inclusion criteria, but we have to remove them because they have not met the exclusion criteria. So the moral of the story is that inclusion and exclusion criteria are not just opposites of each other. So when we are framing our population, we need to be very conscious of those and write them clearly. Now, remember we said that the goal is to get a chief of staff who is very reflective of the president. They have to be aligned. And that is why we take samples, right? And ensure that the samples we take are representative. Obviously, if we were to drink the whole pot of soup, that is feasible, but that is also ridiculous. Like if you just want to taste the soup, why then do you have to drink the whole pot of soup? We just want to taste the population. We just want to see what does the population tell us. So there's no need for us to go and sample all hundreds of millions of people living in country X just because we want to know the prevalence of whatever it is. We can take a sample, but as James Bond would say, shaken, not stirred, right? Well, in this case, we have to stir it. Want to make sure that the sample has been well stirred and is representative of the entire population. And this is the point again. This is what we call the cycle of inference. The cycle of inference means that the population gives us the sample, and this process is called sampling. The sample gives us inferences, which we then apply back to the population. And that cycle goes on and on. In general, we represent the population with a big N, uppercase N. I will represent the sample with lowercase n. So we need to understand that. So it means that this inference here is only valid if the sampling is valid. And the basis for us concluding that sampling is valid is randomness. If sampling is done at random, then there's mathematical basis for making inferences from the sample to the population. If the sampling was not done at random, then there is no mathematical basis for making an inference from a sample to the population. So that's how we need to understand issues of validity, external validity in survey design, right? The whole basis of it lies in how did we select the sample? Was it done at random or not? Now, if it was not done at random, that means that the inferences will only be to this sample. The inferences will not leave the sample, right? And that's fine. It's not as if studies must be representative to the population for them to be useful. When we do a focus group or when we take a confidence sample, there's still a lot we can learn about the world from a non-probability sample. So there's this misconception that, wow, the only important things in this world are randomness. No, sometimes we're just interested in just understanding things about the sample for the sake of a sample, not for the sake of a population. So it all depends on what our intent is, right? So that's why the litmus test for what sampling method to use is the intent to create generalizable knowledge, right? So that's why sometimes researchers will come and they'll ask you, should I use a generalizable sample? It's like, I don't know. That nobody knows that but you, because the litmus test is, what is your intention? If the intention is not to create generalizable knowledge, then there's no point even talking about random sampling. So it all starts with what is your intention as a researcher. Now, if your intention is to create generalizable knowledge, then we need to start talking about, okay, random or probability-based sampling techniques, such as, simple random or stratified or cluster or systematic. The non-generalizable or non-random or non-probability-based sampling techniques include convenience samples, capture-recapture, judgmental or purposive sampling, quota sampling, volunteer, and snowball sampling. So within the world of probability-based sampling, there are a lot of options for us to use. But one of the common questions is, okay, I know I need to use a probability-based technique, but how do I even start? Like, which one should I use? Well, most times in life, that decision is already made for you. So you don't even have a say in the discussion at all. The first question you need to ask is, does a complete, correct, and current sampling frame exist? Or can I create one? A sampling frame is just an Excel spreadsheet that contains the names of all the members of the population. So the first question you need to ask is, do I have a spreadsheet like that? Well, if your answer is no, then you cannot even talk about things like simple random sample, right? Because those require a sampling frame. So there are sampling methods of these ones here. There are sampling methods that require a sampling frame. That is, they require that you have a spreadsheet like that first. And then there are others that do not require a sampling frame. So like cluster sampling, those do not require a sampling frame. Now, we also need to emphasize that issues of sampling is not only about issues of science and precision, or we also have to worry about money. Money is a very important discussion point. You can talk about all the science you want, but who is going to pay for all the cost of running all of this, paying all of these people if there are incentives. Surveys are very expensive, especially when we talk about large national surveys. If you're offering, let's say, $10 incentives to each participant, if you have a thousand participants, well, that's already $10,000 just for incentives alone, right? So it's not just rainbows and flowers and science and precision. You also have to worry about logistics and costs. So a good researcher is one that pays attention not only to the issues of science, but also the issues of logistics and the issue of cost, because we can't talk about precision without talking about, okay, who is going to pay for it? Because there's no such thing as any free lunch in this world. Everything costs money. So you have to obviously think about issues of cost when designing studies. Now, strata. Let's talk about independent strata and how that fits into the conversation. So the decision is to stratify or not to stratify. There is the misconception when you read papers, they say, oh, we stratify to improve validity. That is false. Stratification has nothing to do with validity. We stratify because we want to improve precision. So again, remember, we talked about the distinction between validity and precision, right? Precision is how wide or how narrow our confidence intervals are, while validity is how close our estimate is to the population parameter. The reason why we stratify, again, has nothing to do with validity. It has everything to do with precision. And the reason why we stratify sometimes is we might have some groups in the country that are not very likely to be captured in large numbers if we do not stratify. So let's say in most US national surveys, we typically stratify for minority groups. Like we want to make sure that there are sufficient Blacks and Hispanics in the surveys. So we have to find a way of stratifying. Otherwise, we might end up with a survey where there are just a handful of Blacks or Hispanics. And then if we took estimates for those groups, they will have very wide confidence intervals, right? So that is the reason why we stratify, to make sure that certain groups that are of interest are in sufficient numbers so that when we analyze the results for those groups, their confidence intervals will be, not too wide, they'll be precise. Now, you have to realize, we talked about the issue of cost initially, right? You can't talk about study design without talking about costs and dollars. Who's going to pay for it? Especially when we're talking about stratification. Stratification is not cheap. Stratification is a very expensive thing to do, right? Because it exponentially increases the number of groups in your study. When you stratify, what you are saying in effect is that this group is a population of its own. And that group, so initially, if you don't have stratification, you only have one large group. Once you now start stratifying, you are saying that, in effect, this is a group of its own, and that is a group of its own. So the sample size that you will have needed for that one large group is what you need for each of those individual groups. This is why stratification is not a joke. It's very expensive because you are exponentially increasing the sample size and the cost of a study. So how do we know how many strata are in a study? Well, it's simple. Here we have Mr. Jack or Dr. Jack is conducting a national survey in Wakanda, and they wish to stratify by 3 variables: age, gender, and residence type. So for gender, we have 2 categories, male or female. For age, we have 2 categories, less than 50 or 50 plus. And for residence type, we have 3 categories, village, town, or city. My question to you, pop quiz: how many strata does Dr. Jack have to deal with in the study? We're going to have somebody on mute and answer.
I do need you to raise your hands. Sorry. Okay. Oyefunso.
Jack, we'll be working with 7 stratas.
Okay, close enough. Thanks, but incorrect. Any other? Next try.
Okay. Nsa.
I think it's 3 strata.
Thank you for the effort, but wrong.
Oyefunso. Okay. Abraham.
6.
Thanks for the effort. Thanks for the effort. Still wrong.
Hey.
Surma? Okay. Kobe?
It's 12. Thank you.
Excellent. We have 12 strata. And how do we get 12? Just multiply the category. 2 times 2, 4. 4 times 3, 12. You have to deal with 12 strata. So the strata are males aged less than 50 who live in the village, males, and so on and so forth. So strata in this case are the unique combinations for all the variables involved. So that means that what has happened now is that, Lungle, can you please mute? There's a lot of background interference. So in terms of a sample size, what does this mean? What is the implication for our sample size now?
Dr. Samuel?
Yeah, it means that we'll be having a higher population sample size.
Thanks. Can you be more explicit?
Yeah, what that means is that while we would have considered just maybe a particular group, maybe if we're not considering, let's say we're just taking gender and we just take a pool of male and female, now we are considering age inclusive, and we're also considering resident type inclusive. So we want to be so sure that we cover these three specific areas. So that will eventually increase the population size. I mean the sample size.
All right, great. I want someone to give me an even more specific answer. So in other words, what I'm looking for is whatever our sample size originally was, it is now what? I don't want a specific number per se, but I just want philosophically, what does it then become? We had sample size X. Now it's going to be what?
Johnson?
Yes. Good evening, Prof. It should be population.
Okay. So the question I'm asking for is a numerical question. Our sample size originally without stratification was X. Now we have 12 strata. Our sample size is now what?
Okay. Please mute yourself after speaking. Thanks.
Am I live? Can
Abdullahi? Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes.
Our sample size will now be sample size multiplied by 4.
Exactly. So that is a significant issue. Imagine we had our incentives, we had our budget for incentives as $1,000. Well, the budget now is $12,000, right? So that's why the rules of engagement for stratification are very simple. You don't have to do it, but if you must do it, keep it simple. And if you want, you can keep it as many as you want. The realities of this life will force you to reconsider your options, right? Because when you now realize that the survey cost has grown exponentially, then you realize that, okay, we're going to just focus on the most important variables. So the variables you are choosing on, just pick the most important variables. You can't do everything. You know, even if you wanted to, you can't afford it. You don't have that resources to do it. So you have to be practical. Variables that are used for stratification must be those that are very deeply correlated or, you know, very highly correlated with the outcome. But again, the most important thing here is that you have to consider issues of cost and resources when you're using stratification. Again, remember, we stratify not to increase validity, but to improve precision, to make sure that groups are well represented. So let's talk about clustering before we can come back to this slide before it makes sense. So in our PICO, we said the I stands for independent strata, but then the C stands for clusters. So the question then is, what are clusters and how do we determine what to use as a cluster? The rules of engagement for cluster selection are simple. The rule number one is when a desirable is not available, the available must be desirable, right? Remember we said that ideally, or the gold standard is that we will have loved to have a simple random sample where we have a list of everybody. So remember I said the spreadsheet of individuals is something we must have to do simple random sample. But we also agree that it's not every time that we have a list of everybody in the population. So in this context, it means that the desirable is not available. We will have loved having a list of everybody that lives in, in the country, but we don't have that list. So the next thing we have to look is, do we have a list of the places where people live, or the list of places where people can be found, right? Because we'll have loved to get the people themselves, but since we can't get them, since we don't have the list, the next thing we have to escalate to the next and say, okay, we don't have the names of the people. Do we have a list of where they can be found? And where they can be found could be churches, or it could be mosques, or it could be schools, or it could be communities, or it could be whatever it is, right? Where groups of people are found. That is what clusters are. We need clusters because we will have loved to have a list of the individual people themselves, but we don't have that list, so we have to go next chain up and say, where can we find these people who live in this country, right? We can find they are organized in groups, and if we can itemize all of those groups and sample those groups, well, then we can get the people who live in those groups, right? So that's the whole idea behind clusters. But the point here is that the available must be as close to the desirable as possible. So we want to sample individuals. Now we realize that we cannot sample individuals because we don't have a list of the individuals' names. So we're going to groups of individuals where we can find an exhaustive list of all the groups. But we don't want the groups to be so massive because they should be, the available and the desirable should be as close to each other as possible. Let's give an example of this. Let's say you want to do a national survey in Nigeria. And I said, ideally, you want to have a list of everybody who lives in Nigeria by name. Well, you don't have such a spreadsheet of 200 and something million people's names. So you're like, so what do I have? What can I use as clusters? So here, for the sake of this quiz, you are considering two options. I have a list of all the states in the country. The country has 36 states. I can get a list of all the states. That's not hard. Or I have a list of all the local government areas, which are like counties for those who are not, from Nigeria, right? So I have a list of all the local government areas in this case, or I have a list of all the states. Remember our principle earlier that the available must be as close to the desirable as possible. And remember, this is the individual. When you consider the state versus the county or local government area, which is closer to the individual? Remember the rules we stated here. So in this case, the pop quiz for a national survey of Nigeria, what should we select as clusters? Option 1, states. Option 2, local government areas. What is your answer?
Option 2. Okay, let's see participants raised hands. Chris?
It's the local government.
Okay. Can you explain your choice?
It's because when you look at the hierarchy of the delineation of the different territories, when you start with the country as a whole, then you have 36 states, including the FCT. Then you have the local government, which is the grassroots level of governmental delineation and also even delineation of population. Then you can even have things like ward.
Excellent. Now, why won't we go with, let's say two researchers, you choose to go with local government areas, and another person says that why not go with wards? So for those who are not familiar, wards are now how the local government or counties are broken down, right? What other considerations other than science would kick in at this point?
I think it is the cost because the wards are so much. Yeah, we have 774 local government, and that is a huge cost to consider, and also a huge population area to cover. Then you have wards which are in their thousands. So you consider the cost. You consider there are a lot of factors you have to put into consideration.
Excellent. Does that mean that the guy who chooses to use ward is wrong? if the guy, let's say two researchers, one used words, the other one used local government, will it be reasonable to say either of them is wrong? Well, the answer should be no, right? So what I'm trying to discourage is this black and white thinking that, because survey design is both a science and an art. Because like we said, there's so many things that come into play. Besides just issues of validity and precision, we have to worry about cost. So that's what we want to think about, right? But the moral of the story is that please, if you're designing surveys, don't say we're going to select states as clusters, because it may not make a lot of sense. And here's another reason why, in terms of just putting things in a more concrete fashion as rules. This is the NCHS guidelines for suppression rules. Suppression rules essentially saying when estimates come, we look at certain parameters and we can choose to ignore those results or throw them away if they don't meet certain requirements. What I want to highlight here is this. So the first thing is you're looking at the effective sample size. If is it more than 30, if it's less than 30, you suppress. But the part I want to draw our attention here is it says, okay, look at sample size, look at the width of a confidence interval. And then this is where we want to focus on here, this part here. Are degrees of freedom less than 8? This is, for the sake of our discussion now, this is the most important part of this presentation, of this flow chart here. Are the degrees of freedom less than 8? The degrees of freedom in surveys generally is equal to the number of clusters minus the number of strata, right? So an individual is trying to do a national survey of, let's go back to here, of Nigeria, and they say, oh, well, I'm going to use states. I'm going to sample states, and I will sample from 5 states. Off the bat, what's their degrees of freedom now? Their degrees of freedom cannot be greater than what? Whatever it is at the end of the day, it cannot be more than what? So remember, degrees of freedom equals number of clusters minus the number of strata. So if they selected 5 states as their clusters, at most, what's the number of degrees of freedom they have?
Gifty.
4.
Yeah. So if you have 5 clusters selected, and even if you're not stratifying, that means that is 5 minus 1. And NCHS suppression rule says that if your degrees of freedom is less than 8, then there's very high likelihood that your study doesn't have sufficient precision, and we would have to give it special statistical review. Because how do you imagine that somehow selecting 8 states would somehow, or 5 states would somehow be representative of a country? Your clusters are too large. If this individual had chosen to use the counties or the local government areas, even if their sample size was 1,000 people, it would be distributed across a broader range of the geography, right? And it's more likely to, provide results with more variance. The reason, again, here is that we want variance. As researchers, sometimes when we think of the word variance, we think of it as a negative thing, especially from the context of lab research. Lab researchers always want, this is the reason why they want all the rats to be of a specific type, because they want all the subjects to be identical, right? This is also the reason why women for many years were excluded from clinical trials, because it was thought that hormonal issues might make the population more, heterogeneous. Well, in survey research, variance is not a bad thing, it's a good thing, right? So the more distributed our geography is in terms of how we select people, the greater variance we will have. Imagine you selected the 6 states and all from just one part of the country. Obviously, the variance is going to be very small, and it doesn't really tell you what the president will have said, because here this is a very biased, secretary, right? So that's the reason why we insist that when you're selecting clusters, you want to make sure that the clusters are at the very least the second administrative unit or less. So in this case, the states are the first administrative unit, and then the counties or the local government areas are the second administrative unit. And so that's why we don't want to select states as just a unit of clusters when we're working. All right, let's move on to the outcome, which is the O element in PICO. So here we have to worry about how to define the outcome conceptually and how do we measure it operationally. And here are some important considerations when we design surveys. Generally, our surveys tend to be multi-purpose. You might be doing a survey, but you want to capture a whole bunch of things with that survey, from physical activity to diet and nutrition and smoking. So you have these hundreds of outcomes, but only one of those outcomes can be used to calculate sample size. So you want to pay attention to make sure that what you are using as the representative outcome for sample size calculation is one that covers all of them. Surely, if we are going to pick one of us to speak for us, he should be the strongest person to protect all of us. So the one outcome that is representing all of them must be, designed or selected in such a way that the sample size that result would ensure that whatever we're researching will be covered. We also want to give consideration to whether the outcomes are self-reported or objectively measured. So you want to think very carefully. For certain outcomes, you can ask people to upload things. If I'm trying, for example, to do research on, let's say, type of cigarette smoked, whether it's menthol or non-menthol, well, I could ask them to upload a picture of their cigarette pack so that I can now combine that with whatever report they gave. But that serves as a more objective marker of the outcome of interest. When we're constructing questionnaires, we want to make sure that questions are neutrally framed to avoid bias. Now, if you remember from last week, we said that research questions are born of our own biases. There is no such thing as an objective research question, because there's a reason why we frame research questions one way versus another way, because it's our inherent biases at play. But we also said that once we have decided on a research question, the methodology used to evaluate that question must be objective and must be balanced. And this includes how we frame questionnaires, right? You can't say, you can't ask questions in a way that are leading participants. So you can't say, oh, how harmful do you think cigarettes are? Well, just by asking that question, you have already injected in me the preemption to believe that that cigarettes are harmful. Like, if I never knew cigarettes were harmful, you are indirectly telling me that cigarettes are harmful when you are asking me, oh, how harmful do you think they are? So it's not a question of whether they're harmful, it's just now how harmful they are. You can't ask questions that way in research because we call them leading questions. You are leading the participants. Or you ask a question like, to what extent do you support gun reform? It's like, did I tell you I support gun reform? Like, why are you asking the question that way? You're asking a question to get a particular answer. Those are leading questions. So when you're constructing questionnaires, you cannot bias them in such a way that you get the answer you want. Our research questions can be, framed in whatever way we want, but the way we evaluate those research questions must be objective. So we want to make sure that that is very clear. You also want to consider issues of data cleaning. Data cleaning should be things that we consider proactively. The current approach is people collect data and then they start cleaning the data. Well, how about you give very careful thought to how the data are captured so that it's proactive, not reactive post facto. And then time is also something we want to consider very carefully. Time here is saying, do we want to collect our data in one single snapshot, or do we want to follow up people over time? Obviously, longitudinal data where we follow people over time are more robust because they address issues of confounding by time. We always worry about the chicken and the egg scenario. Did the chicken come before the egg, or did the egg come before the chicken? Well, when we collect cross-sectional data where both the exposure and the outcomes were captured at the same time, it is impossible for us to answer that question. But when we collect longitudinal data, then it's easier for us to answer that question. It's also easier for you to publish your work in a high impact factor journal because it's just considered more robust. And the kind of analysis you can also do with that are more varied. And then lastly, the S is study design. Can you nest other designs in your study? So one of the things we can encourage us to do is to think less of, in simple, plain black and white to more nuanced, thought processes, right? So that you're doing one study doesn't mean that it has to be that one study. You can nest other designs in it. I can decide to nest experiments within my survey, right? I can decide to nest a case control study within my cohort study, right? So and I think I'll be purely from the perspective of efficiency. If I'm going to spend so much money or time or resources doing this, well, I want to get the most out of it. And that's the whole idea behind nesting things within other designs. So, like I said, you get more bang for your buck. It shifts the perceived value of a paper from just an ordinary survey to something that is more sophisticated. If you're doing, for example, a longitudinal design, you can nest a case control in it. So that's why we have nested case control studies. That's exactly what that means. If you're doing a survey, you can choose to nest an experiment in it. And I'm going to show you a demo of that quickly. Obviously, if you're doing a survey and you have a nested experiment, the kind of outcomes matter. You can't say I'm exploring the association between smoking and lung cancer. It's like, oh, it's going to take decades for people to get lung cancer. So what are you talking about, right? The outcomes obviously have to be things that are measured instantaneously. So I'm measuring things like cognitive outcomes, like, or attitudes or changes, transient changes in knowledge. Those are things that will be amenable to, an experiment that is done in the context of a cross-sectional survey. All right, so what we're going to do now is to have a demo of, some of those things we've talked about. How do you calculate sample size for surveys? What are some of the parameters that you need to concern yourself with? How do we sample? And what are some of the key elements that we need to consider, for example, when we're nesting our studies? So let me go over to the demo now and show that. But Lungile, do you want us to take questions now, or should I take questions after the demo?
After, please.
All right, sounds good. All right. All right, so here I have a mock survey that we're going to use for our demo. So we're going to set up a survey. There are 4 questions here, and I try to select the questions so that allows us to demonstrate how we can also do nesting of experiments in just a cross-sectional survey. But first things first, let's look at how to calculate sample size and how to do the other things we talked about on the Chi-Squares platform. So when you're on the platform, and for those of you who do not know what the Chi-Squares platform is, it's a one-stop shop for everything related to research. You can design studies, you can collect data, analyze data, and many other things. All right, so remember I said when defining our population, we need to worry about 2 things. We need to worry about how and how many. So for the how many, that is the sample size we're talking about. So we need to calculate sample size for our study. There are different study designs here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the bottom line is that whatever study design you are trying to calculate sample size for, it is most likely supported by the platform. I'll just focus on the cross-sectional study now, because like I said earlier, we'll just focus on surveys because that's what most people do. So when you're calculating the sample size for a survey, there are certain things you need to provide. The platform has already provided some of the default values, and so you can modify them, of course, but these are very commonly used values. So first things first, you have to provide a level of confidence, which is typically 95%. The prevalence of the outcome. Remember we said that even if you have a survey with hundreds or thousands of outcomes, you can only have one outcome that you are going to use for your sample size calculation, just one, right? So to make sure that whatever number you come up with from that outcome covers everybody, you want to use the most ambitious parameters, right? the most extreme parameter so that if it meets that condition, then it meets everybody else's condition, right? So that's exactly what we're trying to say. It's like saying if we want to pick somebody else to go and fight for us, in a wrestling match, well, we have to pick the strongest guy. Like why would we go and pick the weakest guy? That doesn't make any sense. So here we pick the parameters that ensure that everybody's covered. So here, the prevalence of outcome, we enter 50%. And if you want to understand why that is the case, we've made sure that the platform is very educational. And so you can click hints to explain to you why certain things are provided that way. So here, for example, it says enter a number between 0 and 100, but must be greater than 0. Binary outcomes such as yes or no exhibit maximum variance when the probability of either outcome is equal, right? Think of when we say, wow, the country is very polarized on, let's say, gun reform. Well, polarized means that half of the country supports it, the other half oppose it. That is when you have maximum variance on any given issue, right? So this is a fundamental concept or foundation of binomial distributions. So when we don't know what, when we have a multi-purpose survey, we just calculate sample size for the most extreme case. In this case, the most extreme case is when the variance is maximized. That is why we are using 50. And that's why you are told to use 50% when you don't know the actual prevalence, because it ensures that the sample size we will calculate will cover everybody. Next, you have to provide the population size. The population size by default is provided as 1 million. But it's very important to note that population size has no bearing on the sample size. So another way of saying that is that the sample size is agnostic of population size. So whether you have 1 million people or 10 million people, the sample size will still be the same. In other words, another way of saying that is the sample size you will need for a study for Nigeria overall is the same sample size you will need for Lagos State, is the same sample size you will need for a local government area within Lagos State, because sample size is agnostic of population size. However, there's always a however. The only time population size matters is when we have very, very small sample sizes. So it matters for very, very small sample sizes, but not very, very big sample sizes. So let me demonstrate. So here we have these parameters here. Our sample size, our population size is 1 million, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. When we click on get results, we get a sample size of 1281. Even if I add more zeros here and get results, the population size is still 1281. I can add as many zeros to the population size. It is agnostic of it. So it only matters when you start reducing the sample size to something much smaller. That is when you now have it has a bearing on the sample size. So in this case, if the sample size is very small, obviously, then there is no basis for sampling. It's like, do you need the whole population? So when you have sample sizes that are very, very small, especially with parameters you've selected, like very high low response rates and very narrow margins of error, you will get an error when you try to calculate the sample size. Why? It's because you have a population of 1,000, but the sample size needed is more above the 1,000. That is the basis for the error. So, so you need to understand why, and the reason why we're going through this nuanced explanation is it's not enough for you to just plug in values into anything and get some numbers without understanding intuitively what's going on, right? So that is why I'm trying to explain to you what you should expect, because you need to understand at least on some level, the theoretical basis for what goes on. So in this case, when we have provided our parameters, then we get the sample size. Let me explain a little bit more about some of these other parameters. One of the questions you were asked is, will cluster sampling be performed? So remember, cluster sampling is when we don't have a list of everybody who lives in the country, and we have to use clusters, right? So when we say yes, it's going to open up some other things for us to provide values for. So imagine you said you want to do a national survey and you want to use cluster sampling. Well, there are some things that we need to worry about. One, are you going to stratify? Remember, we talked about stratification, right? Stratification means that you're going to have, a distinct population for each of those groups. So if you were stratifying by rural and urban, it means that this sample size we've just seen, or calculated earlier, you're going to have that for the rural, and then you're going to have another population urban. Stratification simply means we're creating completely different populations, and we can then sample within those populations. So remember, stratification is not cheap, it's expensive. So you want to think very carefully about that. If you're not stratifying, that means that the whole population is just one large stratum. The design effect is a number that punishes us for using clusters. The beauty of clusters is that it is efficient, right? It makes things work when we don't have a list of everybody in the population. Well, the problem with clusters, however, is that the apple doesn't fall far from a tree. People who are in the same cluster look like each other, talk like each other, speak like each other. So they are related, right? And remember, we said in surveys, we want variance. We don't want people being similar. We want people being different. So we don't have a list of the people who live there to use, and we are forced to use clusters. So the question is, how do we correct for the fact that people who are in the cluster look like each other? Well, that's where design effect comes in. The design effect punishes the clusters for being so similar, for people in the cluster being so similar, right? So it punishes them. So if your design effect is 2, that means that, well, I'll punish you by doubling your sample size because you look so similar. Because the whole idea is, if I need a sample size of 100 people, and every second guy is like an exact clone of the first guy, well, it means that after surveying 100 people, I don't have 100 unique responses. I only have 50 responses. So that means that if I'm to get 100 unique responses, I have to double the sample size because the second guy is a clone of the first. So that's the whole thing we're trying to achieve with design effect. So if you don't know the value, you can enter a value of like 1.5. A value of 1 is the same thing as a simple random sample. That is the value we'll expect for a simple random sample. So for a cluster sample, you can, let's say, provide a design effect of 1.5. So if we have our population size as 1 million people, the prevalence of the outcome is 50, number of strata 1, the margin of error is this, and let's say our anticipated response rate is 50, and we get the results. That tells us that we need 1,153, right? So you should be able to see that doubling the strata or increasing the strata will increase the sample size by a factor of a number of strata you have. So if I'm very ambitious and I say, okay, I'm going to use stratify by age, by sex, and by geographic location, so we have 12 clusters there, 12 strata. My sample size is now 13,830 people. That's a lot of people. So stratification, like I said, it's great for precision, but it's not cheap. It's expensive. So you want to use it with caution. You can click on show reference here to see the formula used. The sample size shown here is what we call the effective sample size. So we distinguish effective sample size from nominal sample size. Nominal sample size is the sample size you will calculate with just a plain formula like this. But the effective sample size adjusts for many other things that are not in this formula, which is what is said in this hint, essentially. So you can't just calculate sample size with a plain old formula like this without accounting for a lot of other things. The results you get are true nominally, but do not account for the realities in the real world. So that's how you calculate sample size for a survey. Now, remember we said it's also not about just the number of people in the survey. You also have to worry about how you sample them. So the Chisquares platform also has a mechanism for you to draw representative samples for your study. So here, you can choose to upload a sampling frame. So remember we said the sampling frame is a spreadsheet that contains the elements you want to sample. if you have a list of, let's say, schools or a list of individuals or whatever it is that you want to sample from, you can upload that spreadsheet from here and choose the kind of sampling you want to do, whether it's simple random or systematic or PPS sampling. But let's say you don't have a spreadsheet and you just want to, let's conduct a national survey. You'd come to here and select automatically draw representative sample. You can select the country you want. In this case, let's say Nigeria. If you're doing a survey by state, you can select the state you are interested in, which will be the population. But in this case, our survey is nationally representative, so we don't have to select a state. Now, we have to select the number of clusters. By default, the platform uses the second administrative units as clusters. So that means, in this case, local government areas are used as clusters. So you have to select the number you can access. The number should obviously be more than 7 or 8, because 8 will be the minimum degrees of freedom we will expect in a study. Now, how many should you use? Well, that is a condition. That is a function of how much money you have. If you have, obviously, the more the merrier. But from a precision perspective, we want to ensure that you have a minimum of 8 degrees of freedom, right? But like I said, the more the merrier. In large surveys, we typically use 2% of the clusters in the particular location, between 1% and 2%. Or, you know, but this is not a rule of thumb by any means. So this decision is largely driven by cost. So let's say that in my case, I want to sample 50 clusters of this 775 clusters. And my sample size was, let's say, 2,133 people. So once you do that and click on Get Sample, the platform applies a sampling technique called a two-stage PPS. And we've provided some reading material for you, for those of you who want to know more about scientific methodology, to read how a two-stage PPS works. But that allows you to be able to draw a representative sample of the location, in this case, Nigeria. So in this case, this selects a random sample of 50 clusters in a way that is representative of the whole country. So you don't have to be a survey statistician to know that, okay, this captures the geographic diversity of a country and reflects the population diversity of the country as well. So that's how you can draw a representative sample. And again, remember that we said the reason why we're very particular about ensuring that our sample is random is because it is only on the basis of randomness that we can ensure that results generated from our study are representative or to the broader population. We want to make sure that the difference between the parameter and the estimate is as close to 0 as possible. And the only way we can make that happen is to make sure that there's some randomness in how we select people. Now, let me now quickly go to the survey design and show the other elements we discussed. How do you nest an experiment in your study? How do you ensure that the elements of PICO we talked about are well considered in your study? So let me quickly do that in a few minutes. So for that, you come to survey design. Survey design on the platform allows you to create surveys. The platform will support cross-sectional studies, which is a one-time data collection, but also longitudinally, very importantly. And so for those of you who are trying to apply for grants or who just want to up your research game, well, this is a great opportunity to collect data that are longitudinal. The great thing is that the platform self-tracks people on its own. So you don't have to start following up with people manually every year and say, hey, do you remember me from last year? Once they sign up, the follow-up is automatic. All right, let's get started and do our small smoking survey. So I'm just going to copy the information from here. This is our survey, smoking behavior survey of the location. I'm going to leave it. You can put the location of the participants, or you can leave it blank if you want. Every study must have an aim. You can type in the aim of a study, or if you're not sure, you can use AI. So here I'm just going to click generate with AI, and the platform takes that topic and then will suggest aims for you to use for that research. But of course, nothing stops you from typing them yourself if you so desire. So these are the aims that have been suggested: to examine the prevalence of smoking, to explore patterns of smoking behavior. I'm just going to select some 3 aims here and clear the remaining ones away. Then I have to provide keywords. Let's generate with AI. So smoking behavior, Southeast Asia, let me clear the remaining ones away. And then, of course, this is a research platform, so we have to take issues of ethics very seriously. When you flag that any of this apply to your study, that triggers a notification that your study might need ethical review and clearance. And should you want to do the ethical review on the platform, the platform is linked with an independent ethical review committee that can handle that. So for example, if I say my study involves sex workers or children or minors, that flags that this study might need ethical approval. So then you create a new project. It's a collaborative platform, meaning that many people can work together on the same project in real time. So you don't have to be sending emails to people and say, hey, can you update the questionnaire, right? So all of that can be avoided by adding your collaborators to your project. I'm going to skip that for now, or let me just put in an email just to show you how it's done. So, so let's put in my email, and you assign the individual a role, let's say like co-lead or any other role. There's no limit to the number of co-authors or collaborators you can add. It can be as many as you want. And once you save, that automatically sends an invitation to these individuals to invite them to the project. Here it says your study may require IRB approval. And that was because I flagged that my study involves children and pregnant women. So here I can fill the ethical review form, upload my protocol, and submit it to the platform. And this routes it to an ethical review board or committee in the US, which registered in the state of Michigan, known as the Tasius IRB. But I don't need that, so I'm just going to close this and create my question. So let's create a blank survey. I'm just going to create 2 questions, not all of the ones we had. The first question was just a question to indicate what country are you from. So let's add that quickly. So let's use a drop-down menu question and type what country are you from. So for every question you create on the platform, you need to add a label. The label is what later on becomes the variable name. So it's not a case of you collecting data and then cleaning it later. So the whole idea here is that how do we achieve self-cleaning data so that it's not something like medicine after death? So that as you collect the data, as you download your data, it's ready for analysis. You don't have to do anything on it. So you can create label by asking AI to suggest a label for you. So in this case, these are the suggestions that AI has suggested for my label. I can select country, and then I can enter the countries of the world. Obviously, I don't want to sit here typing all the countries manually. So I can use system supplied values. So here I just select countries of the world, and I can preview how this question will look like. What country are you from? The system has automatically supplied all the countries of the world for me. And so I can then push that to my questionnaire. Now, the question I was particularly interested in was this last one. In your opinion, how effective will the image on this cigarette pack be in discouraging youth from smoking? So let's say I want to nest an experiment in my survey. And my experiment is really to see how do cigarette packaging elements influence risk perception. So I want to randomize people to 3 different cigarette packs, this 3 here, and then measure the impact of what they were randomized to on this answer, right? So in this case, this is an experiment being nested within a survey. Because overall design is a survey, but I'm trying to get a lot of bang for my, for the work I'm putting in. So it makes things more efficient, and it's more sophisticated to a journal saying we perform a web experiment to evaluate the impact of exposure to different types of packages than just saying we did a KAB study. The level of sophistication is just different. But the interesting thing is that the level of effort is the same. The same time it will have taken me, the same effort it will have taken me to create a KAB study is what will take me to create a more sophisticated study that is nested within my cross-sectional survey. So here, for example, I can copy this question here and create a new survey question. The question type will be group allocation questions, and I will select randomized trial. So the question stem was this: in your opinion, how? So that was the question. The label is called, I'll call it harm. And I can then choose the answers. So let's say the answer options were very effective, somewhat effective. I'm just going to use just two options, just for illustrative purposes, right? And then I have to upload the media, which will be randomized to each participant. So I can click here to upload. Let me select the image. It can be anything. It can be audio, it can be video, it can be anything you want to randomize to participants. So here I'm going to select this media, upload them. So those are the interventions that I want to randomize to people. And so what I've done is pick them up from wherever they were and assign them. So I have to provide labels. The reason why I have to provide labels is so that, when I'm analyzing the data, I know which one each individual was randomized to. So I can call this, let's call this red text, red graphic. Labels cannot contain spaces because they are variable names. Green graphic and green text. All right, so, and then I apply. So this, in a nutshell, is how you set up a randomized experiment. So here, I'm looking at attitudes. In your opinion, I'm not looking at some long-term behavioral outcomes that will take years, right? I assign them an intervention, they look at it, and then they provide an instantaneous response based on their cognitive indicators, right? So that is what this is best suited for. And then I can push this to questionnaire as well. Like we said earlier, it is always helpful to define the study population in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria. In this case, this survey is supposed to be only among individuals who are from, let's say, India, Pakistan, and Nepal, right? So what I should not do is to say, provide some instruction and say, please only answer this survey if you are from these countries. Like, number one, you should know that people don't read instructions. So once you are providing instructions for people to obey, that you have lost the war. So instead of saying only answer this questionnaire, you should program that into logic. Logic simply means the rules of a survey that we can use to enforce whatever conditions we want to enforce. So in this case, I'll come to logic. Logic simply means rules, and set the rules for my survey. In this case, the rules I want to set are for inclusion criteria. Remember, inclusion criteria is what determines who gets included in the study. So I can say, let me set inclusion criteria. I'm going to set up criteria with this country called country. I'm done selecting it. And my rule is, if country is containing any of the countries where, well, I'm just going to pick the first three countries on this list: Afghanistan, Albania, and Algeria. If the individual is from any of these countries, include them. That means if they're not from those countries, do not include them. So it's that simple. You don't have to write code or any complex thing. And then once you submit, that's how you set it up. So it's as simple as that. The platform displays some text for you. You can choose whether to include that text in the survey. So this is just text to show people at the beginning of a survey that there are screener questions to determine eligibility. If you want to include that, you can save and include. This will be shown to people who are not eligible to participate. So if you want to include that, you can also edit it, of course. And lastly, for those who are eligible. And that is how you set inclusion criteria. So here, if countries containing any of these, include. If they're not containing, do not include. So there are tons of other logic which you can definitely play with it by yourself when you are trying to practice, and that will really solidify how to set up surveys, both simple and complex. But in a nutshell, that's how you set up surveys. If you want to make sure your study is longitudinal, not just cross-sectional, because right now you can see it's cross-sectional, I can simply go to the study timeline and change it from cross-sectional to longitudinal, right? Remember, we'll talk about PICO. The T there is time. And the question is it cross-sectional or is it longitudinal? So in this case, I want it to be longitudinal. So the questions I have to answer are, how many follow-ups do I want to include, excluding the base survey? So there's a baseline and then follow-ups. So in longitudinal studies, the first one we conduct is called the baseline. Well, because it's setting the baseline, and every other thing is called follow-up. So in this case, I might say I have 3 follow-ups I want to conduct, and the interval between follow-ups, let's say I want that to be 1 year, to be in years. So we'll conduct the baseline, 1 year later, we come and do the first follow-up, 1 year later, we come and do the second follow-up. However, it can be whatever you want to set it up as. So in this case, the platform is telling me that if we start the survey today, the end date will be in 2029, right? And if I'm fine with all of those things, I can save my settings. And that is how you convert your survey from a cross-sectional to longitudinal. So now you have the mode is longitudinal, not cross-sectional. It's always a good idea for you to preview your survey before you share it. The preview allows you to test. You can be a good researcher if you're not very big on quality assurance. Quality assurance means you want to test things to make sure that things are working just the way you intend them to work, that you did not make a mistake or anything. So that's what the preview button does. It allows you to look at the survey the exact way that participants will see the survey. So you can then play with it. So this is the screener questions. What country are you from? American Samoa. So it's evaluating the logic. In this case, it says you are not eligible to participate because that country is not one of the ones we selected, right? So in a nutshell, that's how you can set up a survey. But let me see. I want us to see that second question. So let me pick a country that we had. I believe we had Afghanistan. So now I'm eligible to participate because Afghanistan was one of the countries we had. So we'll go next. This was the randomized trial question we had. So remember, we uploaded 4 different media and we randomized the media to participants so that each individual will be randomized to see one medium or one image, and then they can answer the question, right? So in this way, I can evaluate. I have nested an experiment within my cross-sectional design. It makes it more sophisticated. It allows me to publish on a more, more robust scale, and it's definitely much more likely for me to submit this paper to a high impact factor journal than just one that was saying, well, what are the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs of whatever, right? So that's the end of our class today. I'm going to stop and take questions from folks if they have any.
Okay, thanks, guys. Can you please always be patient, at least wait for Prof to finish presenting before you start asking for the attendance register. I think that's also quite respectful if you can just wait until the end of the presentation. Thank you. Any question?
Awesome, none. So
Daniel. Okay. Zainab.
Thank you very much.
Daniel.
Thank you very much, Prof, for this wonderful lecture. Please, is there anything like objective definition of wide or narrow confidence interval? Wide or narrow? Is there any objective definition?
Well, there are definitions, right? So, so in this case here, let's look at what the NCHS says. Hold on a minute. So by objective, right? And I need to put that in quotes because in air quotes, because there's no universal. So first of all, let me say there are no universal standards, right? Now, having said that, standards have been set by different organizations for the very question you asked. So we're going to use NCHS. Why NCHS? Well, because it's a leading authority with issues of data. NCHS, by the way, stands for the National Center for Health Statistics. It's an agency within the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. All right. So here are the criteria that NCHS has set to tell us whether confidence intervals are too wide or too narrow. It says, is the absolute value of the confidence interval width greater than or equal to 0.3, right? So in other words, what we're saying here is this. Let me demonstrate what NCHS is saying by that. If we have let me open an empty document here. So, we actually have an estimate already. Let me go back to that one initially. So what's the absolute width of this confidence interval? The hint, this is just the bigger number minus the smaller number. That's it. That's all there is to it. Anyone can type it in the chat box too. And then we need somebody to now interpret that result in terms of the question that was originally posed. By NCHS standards, are these confidence intervals precise or not precise? Lungile, are you still here?
I'm here multitasking, so sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. So there's precise, not precise. Let me see. Do we have people? Okay. Dr. Onyime. Dr. Onyime, can you unmute?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. My question is about nesting. I want to find out, is there a limit?
We have to answer the first question first. So you know, let's answer, but hold that thought. We're going to answer your question in a minute. But we wanted to answer the question that the first person originally posed. But hold that, we'll get to you in a minute. So the question was based on the NCHS guidelines, and remember the NCHS guidelines are here. Where are they? Here. NCHS says that the absolute width of confidence interval should not be more than 30% or expressed as a proportion 0.3. So we're saying in this hypothetical example we're dealing with, based on NCHS guidelines, is this confidence interval precise or not precise? It's a simple question. So we want somebody to answer it and give us why they answered that way.
Okay, Kelvin, do you want to try?
Well, I'm waiting for to ask a question.
Oops. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Kelvin. Ola Simeon, maybe you can type on the chat box. Ola Simeon. All right.
All right. I also have a question. I'm not willing to respond to this, please.
Okay, let's respond to the original question first, and then we can answer the other questions. All right. The answer is okay. I'll just answer the question. So the answer is simple, right? We'll take our calculator and subtract 15.2 minus 6.5. Why? What's the answer to that question now? 15.2 minus 6.5 is what? Somebody should just drop the answer in the chat for us. Let's see. 8.7. Thank you very much.
Precise. Okay, you got it.
So 8.7, that's the answer we've got, right? As an absolute difference. So the question then is now we have to say, is 8.7 smaller than 30%? So remember, NCHS guideline is we used the absolute difference should not be more than 0.3, well, as a proportion, or 30% as a percentage. Well, obviously 8.7 is smaller than 30%. So in this case, we'll say that the result passes NCHS standards for precision, right? But like I said, that's not a universal standard, but it's, it's one standard. So that's the first standard that we need to look at. The second standard that NCHS expresses is based the relative CI width, right? So is the relative confidence interval width 130% of the proportion, right? So in other words, NCHS, what they're saying here is that we'll take whatever number we got from there. So let's see. So at a minimum, right, these are the tools that every researcher needs to have in their toolkit. If you're a researcher, you should be able to look at your estimate and say, oh, wow, these confidence intervals are too wide. But that statement should be based on some kind of metric, not just, oh, they look wide. It should be like defensible. And so NCHS at least provides us a framework to think about them. So in this case, where am I now? Where's my confidence interval? Can't find it anymore. Anyway, you take the difference in the confidence intervals and divide that by the proportion. Let me find this. Okay, right here. So the difference, 15.2 minus 6.5 is what? We said 8.7, right? 8.7 divided by 10.1 is what? We need someone to drop the answer for us. Times 100, obviously. What is the answer? Please drop the answer for us in the chat. It's 7%. So thank you very much. Now, we go back to it's 7%. We now evaluate it against NCHS standard, right? NCHS says a result should not be more than 130%. Obviously, 87% is less than 130%. So whether we use the absolute metric or the relative metric, based on NCHS standards, these confidence intervals are precise. I hope that answers that question. All right. Now, the second person can ask their question now.
Okay, I have Bikila. Oopsie, let's see. Okay. Bikila, can you unmute?
Thank you very much. I do have a question under PICOTS, under time. Because different scholars, we do have longitudinal or cross-sectional time of data collection, but under different scholars and also from different literatures, there is retrospective cross-sectional or prospective cross-sectional. Is there such like time of the or data collection or state design in case of cross-sectional?
Okay, so there's no such thing as a prospective cross-sectional study. So the English word cross-section means a single cross-section. It's like you have a slice of bread. That's a cross-section of bread, right? So a cross-sectional means that it's done at one time. If it's not done at one time, then it's no longer cross-sectional, right? It's now longitudinal. So longitudinal means that the word longitudinal, that's the same root word as longitudes. When we talk about longitude and latitude, it means a long period of time, right? So longitudinal studies are ones where we are following people, not just in one point in time, but over time, right? So so we want to mind our nomenclature. We don't want to ever say things like prospective cross-sectional because that makes little sense. So it's that cross-sectional, which is one point in time where we're collecting the exposures and the outcome at the same time, or it's it's longitudinal. Now you mentioned retrospective studies. Retrospective studies were things that were prospective in nature, but we just came late to the show. So since we came late to the show, we have to go back in time, right, and capture that data. So in terms of timing, that could be how you could think about it. And then you could also think of studies that are more so like ambivalent, where we look at historical exposures, and then once we have established them, we then build on them prospectively going forward. So in other words, they're looking both backwards and forwards, right? But to cut a long story short, what we're just trying to emphasize, like I said, we're talking about in the context of a survey that you should, from a design perspective and how to make your work more impactful, decide on whether you want to do it cross-sectionally, one point in time, or longitudinally, where you follow participants over time. I hope that answers your question. And if I didn't get your question correctly, please feel free to ping me again. But we can go to the next question now.
Thank you very much. The second question, here in diagram, there is a 0.03% of what? Yeah, here. Yeah. For 0.30 is of what percent or of what?
The word absolute here means that it's not a percentage of something. Absolute means difference between two things. We just did a demonstration of this very thing, right, a few minutes ago. We took the big number and subtracted from a small number. That's what absolute difference means. All right, next question.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Prof, I'm going to leave. Ilya will take over. I need to join another meeting.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much.
Simeon.
All right, so thank you very much, Prof, for the brilliant presentation. So I have two questions to be precise. So the first one is with respect to collection of data with Chi-square. So I've not really used the platform. I'm new on this. I joined the last session. This is the second time I'm engaging here. So I was just wondering, how can I use this platform to collect data, particularly if I'm targeting, for example, informal sector or businesses where we have large number of people who are not educated? So how do you reach out to them, and how can this platform help to, if I design a survey now, I want to collect data from that cluster, how can this platform help to reach those who are not tech savvy and educated and in informal sector? That's the first question. Then the second question is with respect to the issue of independent ethical committee. For example, here in Nigeria, you have some, if I need to collect the data, I need some approval. For example, I stay in Kaduna State, one of the states in Nigeria. And there's a circular that for anything you want to do in Kaduna State, there must be approval from the Kaduna State Bureau of Statistics. So if I now route it through the independent ethical committee, I know they might want to flag my protocols not to follow their own standards. So how does this work with my local provisions to ensure that the protocols I'm using for my survey and data collection is aligning with what is local requirements? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Great question. So I'll answer the second one first. And the answer is simple. Local policies always trump anything. We aren't making any policy. So your local rules always take precedence. Whatever your university or your institution or your area tells you to do is what you have to do. The Chi-squares platform is not just built for academics. It's built for people who do not belong to any academic institutions. Obviously, you need to be in an institution to take advantage of the arrangements like ethical review boards from that institution. But there are millions of people who are independent researchers. They do research, but they are not part of an institution. So the question is, when people like that need ethical review, where should they go, right? So the platform is designed to address the needs of a very broad range of stakeholders, and not necessarily in specific tandem to those who are in academia, right? So yeah, so bottom line is that yes, you follow what your institution tells you, or what the local policies in your area. For the first question about how you can use the platform allows you to you can download questionnaires as paper and pencil questionnaires and administer them as to individuals where they can write their answers on paper. The beauty of this is that you don't have to start manually doing data entry later. Later you can just scan and upload. The platform allows you to translate your survey into any number of languages. So if I'm doing my survey, for example, I can choose to translate it into the language I'm trying to, let's say I'm trying to go do my survey in Hausa, right? The platform allows you to do the translation in a manner that people can understand. It's always good for people to read and answer things in their own, mother tongue, right? You can use AI to translate, like I'm done here, or you can choose to do it manually. But as the case might be, you can use that to improve how people understand your survey. So those are some of the things you can do. The platform also allows you to administer surveys in offline environments. So you have offline surveys. You can enable offline surveys such that you take your device, like your phone, and go and collect data where there is no internet. And once you come back to where there is internet, the platform will automatically upload the data into the cloud. So there's quite a lot of mechanisms built into the system to ensure that it provides support for a very broad range of use cases. I hope that answers your questions. All right, we can go to the next question. There was a third person who had a question that we interrupted midway because we're trying to answer an earlier question. Please, you can answer your question now.
Thank you very much, Prof. The person that was asking a question, are you here?
Oh, we can take the next person if they're not here too.
Okay. Hafsat, if you are here, you can unmute and ask your question. Hafsat, can you hear me? Okay. Barnabas. Barnabas, you can unmute and ask your question.
Well, maybe it turns out we don't have any questions actually.
Yes. How about three?
Prof, good evening, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I would like to understand. One is that, Prof, I would like to get more clarity on the nested research design and where we can, which field we can apply it in. Two is about stratification and then clustering. Those two terms present some problem to me. Can we stratify and cluster, or can we cluster and also are we able to can we cluster and also
I understand your question. I understand your question clearly.
Yes.
Okay. So this is strata. This are cluster, right? Within strata, everybody looks like each other, right? So as we say they are similar within but different from each other. Clusters are different within but similar to each other. So if we have 4 clusters here, the question is, if all the clusters are the same, do we really need to pick all 4 of them? Or can we just sample from the clusters? Well, the answer is that, yeah, we can just sample from the clusters, because the assumption is that one cluster is like the other cluster, which is like the other cluster. So your question, can we stratify and cluster? Yes, we can. But in a chain of decision making, you have to decide first, are we stratifying? That's the first question you must ask. You don't do cluster and then ask the other way around. That is like medicine after death, right? Remember, in PICO, the P is first. And remember, we said that when you're stratifying, it means that you are treating each of these guys as a different population. So stratification is about defining the P in PICO, right? We're saying, what is our population? And then we're thinking to ourselves, should we use the whole population as one big population, or should we first divide the population into segments and treat each of those segments as a different population? So let's say in Nigeria, you say, oh, I want to use the different geopolitical regions as strata. So that means that instead of having one big Nigeria population, I now have 4 different populations. Now, within each of these populations, let's say I want to do a survey of schools, and I want to use schools as clusters. So that means I come to this first stratum and I sample schools, which are the clusters. I come to the second one, I do sampling there. I come to the third one, and I come to the fourth one. So within each stratum, I am choosing to use different sampling methods. So when you read the literature, you might see things like we use a 3-stage stratified cluster design, right? The reason why we use the word stratified comes first is because, well, that was the first thing in decision making. Stratify first, and then you cluster. Now, is it possible to use clustering without stratification? Yes, we can say, oh, okay, you know what? We don't have the resources to stratify, so we're just going to treat the whole population as a single strata. So that means we're not stratifying. But within that large population, we're going to just select clusters or schools as clusters. So in this case, we have effectively done cluster sampling without having stratified, right? So when we're describing our sampling technique, we will say we use a 2-stage cluster sampling. We won't put stratified there again at the beginning because we didn't do stratification. We'll just say our sampling technique use a 2-stage cluster sampling of the overall population, right? The third question is, can we use stratification only without using any other sampling technique? It's like, well, no, no, you can't do that. It doesn't even make sense. Remember, stratification means you are dividing the population into groups, right? Into distinct populations. All right, so you divided them. Now, what next? So you are saying that, no, then I'm done. Like, then you've not even done anything, right? You divided them into groups so that you can then sample from each of those populations as independent units. So having divided them into groups, we can then sample. So that's why we need to understand, conceptually what these things mean. So remember that strata, everybody's the same. So in the geographic region, we're saying everybody here is northerner, and everybody here is a southerner, and everybody here is whatever, right? An individual can only belong to one stratum. And once we divide the population into strata, we must sample every single stratum. You can't divide them into 4 groups and say, you know what, I will not include these people. Well, that means your study is no longer representative because you have stratified and failed to use one of the key strata. So you can't do that. So once you stratify, you must use all the strata in sampling. Now, your first question about what discipline? Of course, this applies to every discipline. This is not about people who do, whether you do social science or you do anything, it applies to you. The question is, research in general is about identifying the truth. So the question is, how are you going to select people? So that is not a question that is married to a discipline. It's a question that is for everybody. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that question of application, I also referred to nested research design.
Okay, nested. Okay, so nested simply means that you are nesting, you are taking something, you had original plans to do A, and you're simply saying, oh, while I'm doing A, I'm going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. That's what nesting is all about. So the question is, Is there any field that can't kill two birds with one stone? Of course, no. Everybody can kill two birds. It's beneficial to everybody. So it's not, again, it's one of those things that are broad principles that apply to everyone. And most of the things we discuss in our classes here are not tied to a specialty. They are principles that can be applied in any specialty or any field, whether you're in the social sciences or you are in physical sciences. You have to sample. So how do you consider those things? All right, next question. Okay, I guess silence means there's no further question. Ilya, please confirm there are no further questions.
Thank you, Prof. There are three hands, just that my network is a bit shaky. Sir, can you unmute and ask your question now?
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Let's just
Well
go
done
to
for the wonderful
Kelvin.
presentation.
Ilya, sorry, please. The question person, Ilya, I think your network is really bad. I think you may not be hearing the main conversation. So if it's bad, I can just call the folks whose hands are up, and because I think you're interrupting someone. Please continue your question.
All right. My question is about there was this time I read about purposive sampling, whereby you just choose your sample area, for instance, based on your own, your own objective reasons, your own reasons. So is it also applied in how feasible is the purposive type of sampling?
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to this slide I showed earlier. Let's see if I can find. Found. So purposive sampling, like you see, it's here under non-probabilistic sampling. Now, can you use it? Of course, you can use it. The litmus test for which sampling method to use, like I said earlier, is the intent to create generalizable knowledge. Intent is something that is in your head, right? So the question cannot be answered. The question you ask, can you use it? Well, we can't answer that question really, because you're the only one who can answer that question. Why? Because the benchmark for which sampling techniques you should use is based on intent. And since we don't know what your intent is, we can't answer it. So you should feel confident as a researcher to say, well, this is what I'm going to use, and this is why I'm using it. So in your case, it might just be you are trying to get a bunch of school principals to assess some things, and you know the best ones to meet who have a lot of experience. You don't want it to be a random sample because there's a reason why you want to select those individuals. That's fine. It depends on your use case. But obviously, what you should know is that you cannot now take the results from that sample and now say this applies to all teachers in the state, because obviously those people were handpicked. If they were handpicked, that means that they were not randomly selected. So the bottom line of what I'm trying to say is that you should be able to select whatever you want to do, and you should be able to defend it, because at the end of the day, the most important reason for why we do things is based on intent. What is your intent? And nobody can answer that question for you except yourself. Okay, next. I'm just going to pick folks since Ilya has issues with his Dr. Ayam. Okay, Matthew Bolatito.
All right, thank you, Prof, for the wonderful lecture, sir. Yeah, my question is based on what you just answered before the last question now, talking about stratified sampling techniques. You said when you use a stratified and sampling techniques, you have to use another sample like the cluster you made use of example. But we had another type of stratify, which is probability proportionate and non-proportionate. So if you use a stratified, you have divided the population into strata, and you now use proportionate to sampling. Is it okay to go on with your data collection, or you still need to use another one after using either proportionate, stratified random sampling, or disproportionate?
Okay, proportionate sampling is not a different form of sampling. Let me just explain to you what proportionate means. Let's go back to the image we had, if I can find it. All right, great. So, the opposite, what would you say is the opposite of proportionality in the context of sampling? If it's not proportional, it's what? Okay, I'll supply the answer.
Not,
so that, okay,
it's not proportional.
Oh, that's a good way to evade the answer. Sure. So it's either proportional or so think of proportionality or equality. Here, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each of these boxes has 7, right?
Yes.
So the sampling in terms of sample size is based on the framework of equality, because we want to give so much emphasis on ensuring that there's balance in the numbers when we actually analyze the data. So we're emphasizing balance. So we know that, okay, well, we're just going to make sure that all the groups are balanced. But let's now imagine that this distribution, because now this assumes that the percentage of each of this group is what in a population. What does this assume? That each of these groups represent what percentage of a population?
Yes, like 25%.
Excellent. Now, let's say that is not the actual percentage, right? Let's say that this group is like 60%, and then this one is 10%, 10%. In this context, then, what kind of strata are these? Are these strata proportional or disproportional?
They are disproportional.
Exactly. So the answer to your question, what I was trying to emphasize to you is that it's not as if you stratify and then you now do proportional sampling. No, proportional sampling or disproportionate sampling is just telling us that in the way we created the strata, are they proportional to the actual distribution in the population, right? So whenever we use disproportionate sampling, that means that we are oversampling some groups. So the word oversampling is synonymous with disproportionate sampling, because it means that we have captured more of those people in our strata than they actually exist in the population. So that takes us back to the original question, which was, can we just stratify whether it's proportionate or disproportionate and just leave it at that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think with what your response now, you still have to use another sampling to, like the cluster sample that you have used earlier.
Yeah,
Before
think
we
of it
can go ahead.
exactly. Think of it this way, right? You have a whole mass of people that you want to distribute food to. Let's say you have loaves of bread, and you have put these loaves of bread in baskets. Now you just have the baskets and drop them like, okay, the work is not done. Someone has to go and actually give these people the bread in those baskets. So the fact that you've put them in nice baskets does not mean your work is done. It means you have to do something else. So stratified sampling cannot exist on its own, just like stratified sampling alone. You have to use another technique with that to now distribute. Think of it like that illustration I gave you, right? So no, it cannot exist in of itself. Whether it's proportionate strata or disproportionate strata, it does not matter. We need to combine another technique with it to achieve the results we want. Make sense?
All right, thank you, sir.
Let's go. Kelvin, your hand is up. And then Hafsat after.
Yes. Prof, thank you so much for this opportunity, sir. So actually, my question is concerning the platform. Can I use the platform for a complete research, in the sense like I can write my objective, my abstract, my just like into chapters, my problem statement problems, the conclusion, result, methodology from with this very platform?
Yeah, so we're releasing the full, what we have now is version 1 of the platform. We're releasing the final version in April that will allow you to do any kind of analysis. You have a word editor and so many other things. So then you can do anything of that nature you described. So stand by for when we announce the release.
Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate it.
Welcome. Nafsat was the next person. And after that, we'll have Abraham Koyara. Okay, Abraham, you wanna ask a question?
Yeah. Prof, thanks very much for the insight. Mine is just a follow-up on the second but last questioner. It has to do with a survey, like in a region, you intend to carry a rural-urban survey on data of ANC and then skill-based delivery utilization. But at the end of the day, you contacted the Ghana Statistical Service as to how the whole region is stratified in terms of rural and urban. And they gave you like an average figure that based on the last population survey that was done, a community that is 5,000 plus is deemed as an urban population or a community. So you launch the survey after you have done your calculations. When you got to the fields, you realize that most of the data that you are collecting is skewed towards rural. So at the end of the day, you realize that the rural population you had, it was like double than that of the urban. So, Prof, in that sense, what do you do? Thanks and over.
Thank you. So it seems that you wanted to use stratification, but you ended up not using stratification because from what you said, it's like you divided the population into strata. And what we have expected from you next was that you are going to treat each of those as different populations. So you go and sample from the rural and you go and sample from the urban, right? But it seems that even after you seemingly stratify the population, you still treated them as one. So there's now a mismatch between what you wanted to do versus what you actually did. So that is so it's now if you have a problem with that, one of the solution is weight, right? What weighting? So we said initially that we want a scenario where the sample is representative of the population. Now the question is, what happens when this does not happen? What happens when the sample does not look like a parent population? Does this mean that we cannot make this statement here, this inference? Well, we can, right? And that is where weights come in. So now you have your sampling approach did not meet the objective. So, but all hope is not lost, right? Statistics to the rescue. We can do calibration weight. And what weight does in a very simple nutshell is that the weights force the sample to look like the population. Imagine you take a lump of clay that is very amorphous and you want to squeeze it into a bottle so that the shape of the clay takes on the shape of a bottle. And then you can say, oh, the bottle looks like the clay or the clay looks like a bottle. So what weighting does is that it creates a pseudo population that forces the sample to take on a characteristic. So when you now stratify or when you now tabulate, for example, the variable for urbanicity, after weighting, it will look like the parent population, and then you can have a bit more ability to use, what do you call it? To use to make inferences. And weighting is simple. It's a complicated process, but we've really simplified on the Chisquares platform. If you want to weight your data, all you have to do is come to the survey you have and come to weight data. Now, of course, your survey has to be completed before you weight because it's taking the whole survey and weighting it. So let's pause the survey now just to show you how Okay, we've not even launched this survey. Obviously, we don't have data to wait. But what this does is, let me launch. I just want to demonstrate to you to conceptually so you can know how to address it. Obviously, so we need to we don't have a single data point, but that's not the point. We just want to show you how to think about it. So, oh man, I don't have any response here. So, but here's what you're gonna try, right? You should try, come here to manage collected data, come to weight. Surely if you have data there, you'll be able to, what it's going to ask you is that, first of all, you're going to select, let me just go pick another survey. Hold on a minute. Let's use this one. This has, so now we don't have issues with that because it has data. When you're setting weight, obviously you've not created any weight, so it says no weight configured. Create new calibration weight. The first thing is for you to create the variables that you want to weight on. So let's say that you want to, in large national surveys, we typically weight our data on up to like 30 variables. So when you take a national survey, like, whatever survey, and you get estimates and they say, oh, they're representative, it doesn't just happen by magic, right? There's a lot of statistical work going on. Because remember that in most surveys, we do oversampling, which is disproportionate stratification, which will still give us the same headache you're complaining about, because we end up with a sample that does not reflect the parent population. So this is exactly what we do in such cases. We use calibration weight. On the Chi-Squares platform, we've implemented what we call raking. Raking is the gold standard for weighting processes, right? So you select the variables you want to weight on. Let's say I want to weight on, let's say this is age, for example, right? Oh, this is the name variable. Let's say, and this is a bad example because I'm not even sure what this data is all about. But for the sake of demonstration, let's say these are the categories of the variable. You have to provide the percentage, the calibration weight, or the marginal percentages. These are the percentage for that categories in the population you're interested in. So in your own case, that would be the overall Ghana. What percentage of all Ghana? Let's just pretend that these are age and sex, or let's say gender, male and female. And we have to enter the percentages. In all of Ghana, what percentage of people are male and what percentage are female? You do that for that variable, and you do that for all the variables you want to weight on. Once you're done, the platform will generate a new variable in your data set called weight, or whatever name you give it, right? And when you now weight your data, it will give you representative results. That's the magic behind weighting. It's a way we force results that are from a non-probabilistic sample so that they become more representative. This is what all major newspapers also do. When you fill a survey from a New York Times saying, oh, fill our survey. Obviously, you're filling the surveys online. That's like a volunteer or a convenience sample. But the magic behind that process is that they will end up using calibration weight to force that sample to become like the national sample. So in your use case, that's what you have to do. But remember, this is only important if you are trying to make inferences to the population. If you're not interested in making those kind of inferences, then you don't have to worry about this. Because remember, we said the litmus test is there intent to generalize knowledge? If there is an intent, well, you have to either sample probabilistically at the very beginning, or if for whatever reason your sample ends up not being representative, you have to force that sample to become that by using weights. So that's the long and short of it. All right, let's see. Rash. And after that,
Yes, thank you very much, Prof. And thank you so much for the insights. Frankly, this is the first time some of us have gotten to join, and the whole thing is appearing to be abstract. If I want to plead, if you can just use a minute or so to just say what it is. I know you're talking about sampling and research designs and things like that, but exactly, I think it's a tool or software. Then secondly, earlier you mentioned that somebody could not say cross-sectional, prospective cross-sectional. And I want to find out whether you can say retrospective cross-sectional. Thank you and over.
All right, thank you. So in a nutshell, what we're doing here is to say, how can we become better researchers? Well, we cannot become better researchers if we don't know research principles. So all we're doing is, we have webinars where we try and distill, core scientific principles in a way that all tenants can understand. And we also show how to solve some of the complex problems in research with, the Chisquares platform. So the Chisquares platform is a one-stop shop for different research tasks. So if you want to collect data, if you want to sample or do sample size, you can do all of these things on the platform. In a nutshell, that's what we're doing. So this particular thing, you just joined today, but it's part of a 3-week series where we're trying to, it's themed research clarity. So, we're just trying to provide some of the basic foundational aspects of research. And then people can ask questions. We always hear till last person who has a question to make sure that everybody has clarity. So if the sessions are long, it's not because the talk itself is long. You can always leave when we are done, but we always try to answer everybody's question until the last person where possible. So that's the first part. The second part is, if you're saying cross-sectional, please just say cross-sectional, right? We don't have any recognized retrospective cross-sectional study in epidemiology. Cross-sectional means it just happened once. Retrospective is used in the context of retrospective cohorts, right? We don't even want to say retrospective case control studies because obviously case control studies by definition are retrospective. And the reason why we can't apply the word retrospective cross-sectional is because the metric for assessing prospectiveness or retrospectiveness of studies is, where does hypothesis, the generation of hypothesis, stand in relation to the exposure, and where does the exposure stand in relation to the outcome? Well, in the cross-sectional study, both the exposure and outcome are measured simultaneously at the same time. So that concept does not really apply. So we don't want to force a square peg in the round hole. So I hope that answers your question. Sakibu, your question? And after that, Bikila.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, mine is just on the. Okay, mine is just on the data cleaning. You talked about it just briefly. Maybe if you can just highlight the way you explained on the weighting, so that we can be able to see, okay, what do you look for in terms of the missing data, and why is it relevant to do the data cleaning? Thank you.
All right. So sure, we can do that. So on the Chisquares platform, when you collect data, so first of all, we want to make sure that when we think of data cleaning, we should do it prospectively, right? It should be reactive. It shouldn't be reactive, it should be proactive. It's not something we collect, because it's like medicine after death. You wait for bad things to happen and then you try to correct them. Every single thing we do as part of data cleaning is something that can be prevented, right? Because like what does data cleaning mean? Cleaning is like you're trying to wash a garment, and there are two things that are involved in washing the garment. You are removing things that should not be there but are there, or you are putting in things that should be there but are not there. So for example, you're removing dirt from that garment because it should not be there, and the garment should smell nice, so it doesn't. So you're putting some perfume or whatever, right, to the garment, while washing it. That's what cleaning means, essentially. Those two things. We're removing something or we're adding something. Now, when we think of it in terms of data cleaning, what things are we removing that should not be there in the first place? Well, we are removing things like variable names that are entire sentences. If you collect data on certain platforms, after the data collection, you now have to start creating variable names. Now that's very dangerous because that creates room for error, right? And anytime you're doing anything manually, it's always a bad idea because the margin for error is so high, right? So you are adding variable names, you are adding inconsistencies, you are checking for inconsistencies and reconciling them, and things of that nature. Well, every single one of those things is preventable, right? So on the Chisquares platform, the way we've architected the solution is such that the platform yields the self-cleaning data. So when you're collecting your data, that's why you have the option to download either the raw data set or the clean data set, right? Data already, already cleaned in the act of collecting the data. That's why when you're creating variable names, you have to supply labels. The labels later on become the variable names. So we've looked at that process and we've just simply re-engineered it so that the need for manual cleanup data is completely eliminated. And it also evident in the validations that are in place to prevent things like illogical entries and so on and so forth. So that all you have to do is just download the clean data set and use. But of course, if you want to suffer, we also encourage it. So you can download the raw one and clean it yourself too. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah.
You have a follow-up question?
Thank you.
Alrighty. Chima, your hand is up too.
Yeah, I do. Shall I continue?
Okay, go ahead quickly, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prost. I don't know whom is from our colleagues. We can say retrospective cross-sectional, he said, but that is not clear for me because in case of longitudinal, we have a starting point, whether case or exposure, we can go either forward or backward directions. But in case of cross-sectional, we have no starting point because it's egg and egg dilemma. So how we can say retrospective cross-sectional study is not clear for me.
Okay, maybe you didn't hear me clearly. So let me make myself very clear. There is no such thing as a prospective cross-sectional study, and there is no such thing as a retrospective cross-sectional study.
Okay, but I heard just one colleague said retrospective cross-sectional. If not, that's good.
No, I'm just correcting that there's no such thing called a prospective or a retrospective cross-sectional study. Such a thing does not exist.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Joshua. Okay. Dr. Bayomi.
Hello, Prof.
Yes, go ahead, please, Joshua.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the explicit class so far. Mine is first, I wish to make an appeal or a request that the slide for this class, if possible, should be shared to us, maybe through our email. I'm making an example from the previous class. Some of us, we always experience network challenge. And along the line, we may be cut off from the class and check in again and all that. So from the download I had, the record, I can't read from the content. And these illustrations are very, 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 very important and useful that one can use it to recall or learn something new or remember something that may have been taught. That is one. That is apart from the record of the class that is being shared. Then my question, I will need some clarification from the aspect of sample distribution of questionnaire, particularly. Let's assume that I have a population of 5,000 to study a particular state, and in the state in Nigeria, as where I am, let's assume that to study Taraba State, and Taraba State has 16 local government, and from this 16 local government, the population, let me say, of 2023 registered voters, let me say 22,000 electorate registered, and 22,000. And from this 22,000, I am able to get samples and using maybe Tarokiamni's 1967 formula derived by him. And I am able to get up to, let me say, approximately 400 sample. And from this, the general sample population, and I may not be able, maybe I feel as to select, let me say 9 local government from the 16 to distribute this questionnaire. And let me assume that I am to use this particular thing. Is it proper for me to use proportional? To have exact number of attributed to this particular number of local governments. I need clarification based on the proportional perspective, which actually is not a stratified study. So I just need clarification from this angle, Prof. Thank you.
Well, if it's not a stratified sample, then the issue of proportionality does not arise, does it? The issue of proportionality arises when we're talking about strata. So if we're not talking about strata, then that is a moot point already.
Okay, Prof. In this case, let's from my example, and I have this number. Is it proper for me to select from this 16 local government to still select, that is, have not to distribute this questionnaire to the entire local government? And maybe let me still explain myself. These local governments do not have the same number as equal that register for the election. That is, register voters for the election. So how will I go about distributing it according to the size of the local government?
Okay, so I think the major problem with your study is that you have not carefully defined what your study population is. So that is what is very apparent. You have not decided whether your study population is all human beings who live in Taraba State, or if it is registered voters who live in Taraba State, right? That is why the first element.
It is registered voters.
So
okay.
In that, you will then have to, assess whether there is. Sorry?
Yeah, you're trying to say something, the first element, maybe.
So the first P of PICOTS means you define your population. Sometimes there's a mismatch between what we have on the ground versus what we want, and one thing must change. So most times we end up having to go and we might have to redefine our population again until it aligns with what we have, so that when we're making inferences, it aligns with what obtains on the ground, right? In US surveys, for example, we'll say these surveys are surveys of the civilian, non-institutionalized adult population. The reason why we put all of those caveats is because, well, we couldn't access the military. We couldn't access people in institutions. So we have to redefine the population. That's the first thing in study design. All the other issues of sampling are up to you, depending on logistics. So they're not questions that we can answer. It depends on, and that's the point I was trying to make earlier. Don't think of it as, is it right or wrong? Think of it as, in my use case, does it fit the context or does it not fit the context? Because that is what matters essentially. As far as you're drawing the samples at random, then however you choose to do it as a function of how you define your population is fine. Regarding the first question, we share the slides on LinkedIn. So we upload our slides we don't send them via email. So you would have to go to our page on LinkedIn and download the slides from there. All right.
Thank you very much, Prof.
You're welcome. Dr. Abayomi Samuel.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Brilliant as always in your presentation. Yes, you answered the question earlier on, talking about waiting on the platform. I quite understand the principle, but I'm a little worried about if the sample is not representative initially. For instance, if it's a study considering Nigeria, and then there is nothing like geopolitical zone or stuff like that to make proper representation. And eventually you are waiting on whatever was gotten, maybe from just one local government or stuff. Then how can we then talk about true representation? Because you mentioned that the essence of having to work backwards on that sample is to see how representative, that sample could be, and then, forming some kind of a population sample, so to speak, if I understand you. So I'm now worried about how can that truly be representative if we are working backwards that way. I mean, it's a little confusing to me. Maybe you can give some clarity.
Right, sure. So when we're waiting, right, you should notice that the variables, let me make it more explicit. You select a variable here. This is a very poor example because there are no good variables here. But that's besides the point. This is just to illustrate the point. So let's say this is whatever variable this is, just pretend that this is gender, right? The user has to provide the categories for this variable in the population they're trying to calibrate to. It should be obvious then that you can only wait on variables for which you have data in your data set and in the population. In the example you cited, you said in the small survey they have no variable on geopolitical zones. Well, obviously then they cannot wait on that variable. You can only wait for a variable that you collected in the data set. You cannot miraculously create things and and address them. So that's point number one. It can only be done for variables that exist in your data set. Point number two, weighting creates a pseudo population, right? What we're saying is that we are forcing the sample to look like the parent population. What we have created in effect is a pseudo population. It's called a pseudo population because it is a population that does not exist anywhere. It only exists in our statistical imagination, right? And it is a statistical model. The point of a model is a model is a simplification of reality. It is meant to explain the world in a way that is a little more accurate. So nobody made a claim that this was a replica of the population. Statistically, philosophically, we always said it is a pseudo population, right? So before we were critiqued, we said no. For those who have come and said, who will say this is not the true population, it's understood to be a replica or a pseudo population that's something that looks like the population, but it's not the population. So obviously, when we're interpreting results from any weighted data, it is with that understanding that the result may not be. So if you look at, for example, pick an MMWR, for example. So MMWR smoking. Let's see. You see the language where we use, right? In such federal reports. Let's see. Hopefully this is here. Okay. This particular report doesn't have it here, but in general, we typically would say that even though these results were weighted, they still may not be fully representative of population. That's like standard language we use for most of this report. And so that's just attesting to the fact that, yes, we acknowledge that we have tried to reduce, the gap, but we've not, we may not have eliminated it completely. Remember, we said bias is simply quantified as the true population value minus the expected value or the result from our result. If that difference is not equal to 0, we have bias on our hands. Now, we may not reduce it to 0 with weighting, but at least we'll make it closer to 0. So there may still be bias, but not as profound as when the results were unweighted. Does that answer your question? Right, I will assume it does. Chima Akunwata. or Abisoye Oyeyemi, or Osborne Sedem. Okay, Chima,
Hello.
you're unmuted. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I actually have two follow-up questions for questions that was asked earlier. One is this.
Sorry, hold on a minute. Give me a second, please. Hold that thought.
All right.
All right, I'm back. Please continue.
All right. Thank you. I can continue now. So,
yes, please.
With respect to using a paper questionnaire to collect data, you said something about uploading it on the site. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
So when you upload it, what would the site extract the data you collected on the paper?
Yeah, so there are two ways you can conduct offline surveys on the platform. The first is offline with paper, where you print the questionnaires. They're not just any kind of questionnaires, they are barcoded. So let's see. Something like, let me go back to this survey. Let me see. So this survey, so you can say, I want a paper and pencil questionnaire. It's going to ask you how many copies of the questionnaire do you want? Let's say I want 5 of them and in the language you want. And so you have to check if they're supported questions, like they're experiments, right? But if they're none, you can download. The questions come with barcodes at the top. So you can administer the questionnaires and you scan and upload, right? And yes, the platform will automatically extract the answers with AI and, and reconstruct the database. But if you don't want to do it that way, the second option for you is to administer the survey offline, but with electronic data capture. So in that case, you'd come to offline survey, you enable the data collection. So this time, the users, you take your device like a phone or tablet, has no internet, that's fine. The interface is exactly the same way it would be if you had internet. You collect the data. The difference is that the data are being stored on the device so that whenever you come to an area that has internet, the platform will automatically upload that data into the cloud. So you don't have to worry about having to scan and upload and anything. So those are the two options for you to capture data in areas where you don't have internet.
All right, thank you. So, well, let me just add this question, even though it may appear repetitive. So the first thing is to design the questionnaire on this platform. That will be the first step.
That is correct.
All right, thank you. So the second question I have, the second follow-up question, unfortunately, the people that asked the question may not be here again. I want to do a study that will be generalizable, but the people like the clinical patients I would want to use for this study, there are not many. So most likely, if I will even satisfy the sample size, I have to do maybe purposive sampling method. Is there another way I could have done it so that it will be more generalizable?
If it's not randomly selected, then you can't talk about generalizability. So that's the very first thing we said. We said, what's your intent? If the intent is to generalize, but so study design must align with the realities in the world. So if your intention was to generalize, but the reality in the world is that you can't, especially for rare, if a condition is rare, well, very unlikely, then it's not a random selection is not going to work. You might have to use something like a snowball sampling, which obviously is non-generalizable. So you have to cut your coat according to your size. So in this case, you have to do a non-generalizable study, and that's fine. It's not only generalizable studies that are useful. Non-generalizable studies to have meaning and value in the world.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Osborne or Abisoye Oyeyemi. Whoever comes first. If they're not around, I believe we've had everybody whose hand was up to ask their questions. Abisoye, do you have a question? Your hand is up. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next week for the last session. Have a great weekend. All right, bye.